Today, I'd like to take you through my approach for learning new pieces of music. And what led me to this was I was getting increasingly frustrated that pieces were just seeming to take such a long time to learn. Now, of course, for some pieces, it's sort of to be expected, isn't it? The really complicated pieces just will take time. But other pieces of music that theoretically weren't that challenging were still taking me far longer than I thought was right. And to make matters worse, I couldn't actually spot any particular reason for this. So trying to fix this problem was what actually led me to my 4-step process. And it's the process I've used for all of my recent tutorial videos. Are you sitting comfortably? Then let's begin. I believe that for all of us, there comes a point when the standard beginner advice of simply slow something down is no longer sufficient to overcome the challenges within the music we're trying to learn. As things become more and more intricate to play, then they become more and more difficult to practice. And that's why I think having a process to wrap around the way we go about practicing these things is extremely helpful. I spoke about the basic ideas that I use in the 3 videos I've put up on the screen here for you. However, after I'd recorded them, it then really struck me that that's sort of more of a process when you put them end to end. And I'd noticed that as I'd been applying this end-to-end process to them, I was making far faster progress with my pieces than I ever used to. So I've nicknamed my 4 steps as Discover, Divide, Conquer, and Integrate. However, one thing that has become very apparent to me as I've been using this process over the past couple of years is that in reality, it's not sequential steps, but they're very much overlapping steps. And this is particularly true with Conquer and Integrate, but equally it's true with Discover and Divide. So let's have a look at each one of these in turn. Discover is a step that I didn't include in the original 3 videos, but it's actually really important. And it's a step where we try to get an understanding of the music. And this can include things such as reading through the score. It includes things such as listening to good performances of that music. It also includes a couple of initial playthroughs, nice and slowly, just to see how the music fits under our fingers. And another thing that I found very helpful is to actually time how long it takes pianists to play through the different sections using a stopwatch. And that, in fact, was the subject of the very first video I released on this channel. So basically, the better we understand the piece, the more intimate we are with it, the better we'll be able to practice it and the better we'll be able to perform it. And I think that this Discover step extends through the whole time that we learn in the piece. The Divide step is where we split the piece down into more manageable building blocks, if you like. For a long time, I just used to split something down into sections. So if you take, for example, a Liszt transcription of Schubert's Serenade, I would split it down into sections like these here. However, it occurred to me that this was only really part of the answer. And effectively, if you look at any one section, you can split that even further down into things that I eventually nicknamed as segments. So again, if we look at this same Serenade, take the first section and you can actually split it into 4 segments. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the music is ever so slightly differently designed in each different segment. This then means that we can actually practice each of these segments as a self-contained little thing, if you like, which can be particularly useful if we've got very limited time to practice any given piece on each day that we practice it. And as a general rule, I'd say that probably 80% of my practice time is actually at the segment level. However, what I do before jumping into practicing it is I'll then split these segments even further down into what I've called snippets. And effectively, the snippets are the starting point of the Conquer stage. These very small building blocks, quite often of not more than a measure or 2, are where I do most of what I think is my problem solving. So this is things like working out what fingering I'm going to use. It might be practicing a particular technical challenge, such as a jump or a bit of complex passage work, or a voicing challenge of a chord. So if you look at the Serenade again, I would probably not split the first and the 4th segments down any further, but certainly the middle 2 I would split down into a set of snippets because they're a little more involved. Now, if you've seen any of my recent tutorial videos, you'll have seen lots of these color-coded screenshots, and you might think, oh dear, that's an awful lot of work. However, don't forget the screenshots I show you are just really to make the videos a little clearer. When I do it for my own purposes, I just use a set of squiggles that are perfectly understandable to me. So all in all, it takes very, very little time to actually do the divide part. The snippets are generally also the place that I'll work out how I need to practice something. So clearly some segments will lend themselves to cohesive ways of practicing all of the snippets, but quite often you'll find that there'll be one or two within there that is a little more difficult and will take extra ways. And generally our initial playthroughs will point to the places where this is going to be the case. And I think my general rule is that once I can actually play a snippet, then this means I've conquered it because I've fixed whatever problems might have been in that snippet. However, if I can't play it, then that does point to an underlying problem that I'm going to have to solve. So to give a really obvious example, if speed is the problem we're trying to solve and we can't get 8 notes up to the correct tempo, then there's very little point on practicing 800 notes because we'll definitely not be able to get them to the right speed. However, where things become increasingly powerful is that often we might need to conquer something in stages. Even with a single snippet, there might be occasions where it pays to actually simplify it somewhat. And this is where we can actually overlap the conquer and the integrate stages. So to give you an example, let's look at the third section of the serenade. Now here, the right hand's got an awful lot to do, so there's a lot going on, and to try to play that all together straight away could be extremely daunting. And this is then why I would actually simplify it at first, so I get myself to a stage where I can play the entire segment, but using a simpler version. So in this case, if I simplify the right hand to just play the main melody and play that along with the left hand, I end up with something that sounds like this. And when I first do this, I start snippet by snippet because there might be a problem that we don't necessarily see straight away. And in this case, this particular chord for me is not really very comfortable. So before I start practicing this as a segment, I'll want to make sure that for this particular snippet, I fix that problem in my left hand. And equally, we want to maintain a legato sound as we jump to the thumb to play the melody here. And that means that practicing just the snippet on its own can really help us with focusing in on that particular technical challenge. And then once all my little problems are fixed, I can actually start practicing the segment as I described earlier. And we might actually practice it like this over several days so that we can spend some time, whilst the right hand's got less to do, we can focus on the left, make sure that stays nice and light, make sure it stays nice and comfortable. We can also focus more attention just to that little jump to the thumb to make sure we don't get a bump as we're playing it. Then our next step could be to start to add in some of the additional notes. So that's the little echo, if you like, of the melody that we have in the right hand. So we might initially add just the first of the triplet notes and maybe the other bits of the echo that are elsewhere. And again, we might stick with doing this for several days to make sure that it starts to feel nice and comfortable for us. And only once it is nice and comfortable would we add in the remaining notes, so we've got an as-written version. However, in every case, as I move from one stage to the next, so as I add in more notes, I first go back to these individual snippets, add in the extra notes in that snippet, see if it gives me a different problem that I need to solve, and once I'm happy that I can do all of these, then I'll start practicing the segment. One big advantage to always trying out with such tiny little building blocks is that we very quickly work out if the practice technique we're using is helping or not. And sometimes we might need to add extra practice techniques because we're not able to fix a particular problem with an individual snippet. So another thing we can do here, and I mentioned it in my practice principles video, is make sure we always take a step backwards each day when we start practicing. So for example, if yesterday we got to the point that we were practicing an entire segment together, let's today first just quickly start off snippet by snippet, make sure everything's still fixed, and then go back to practicing the segment before perhaps deciding that we'll go to the next stage. Now, the reason I like solving the problems at the snippet stage, but then practicing mainly at the segment stage, is that, of course, still at this point, things might go wrong every now and then. And if we're playing a relatively short segment, it's very easy for us to remember what went wrong. However, if we were playing a longer section, then there might be so many different bits that we didn't like in there that we can't actually remember what we need to fix. Now let's think a little more about the integration step itself. So as we've seen, we can very quickly start integrating our snippets into segments. However, we also need to think about integrating those segments into the section. And interestingly, here we can even do this perhaps earlier than you might think. Again, going back to the serenade, let's just say for this first segment, we're quite happy we can play it as written, but the second segment, we're still working on a simplified version. Then nothing stops us playing through both of them together, but playing the first segment as written, and then the second segment with the simplified version. Now, I wouldn't overdo this and spend too much time on it, but it is useful to keep thinking in slightly longer and longer lines as we're learning something and we get further through a piece. And of course, the next stage is that as two adjacent segments come together as written, we can then start practicing these both together. So effectively, our piece starts to become less and less divided. And of course, we can always use the technique of add-on. So rather than going from two individual segments to two added together, we can add bits of one segment to the other by using snippets. So first we add one snippet, then two, then three. And in fact, I found that in general, it's easier to integrate in this way. So gradually, over time, we end up with a fully integrated section that we can play from beginning to end. However, the next step then is to think about how sections join to each other. So one thing that I've found to be very useful is to actually practice the last segment of one section with the first segment of the next, so that we get used to that transition between the two. And our final integration step, of course, is to add all the sections together. And even here, to be honest, we can be a little creative. So let's just say with the serenade that we're at a point now we can play sections 1 and 2 together as written, but section 3, given it's the most complicated one, we're still using a simplified version. So what we could actually do is play through the entire piece, playing sections 1 and 2 as written, playing the simplified version of section 3, and then assuming we can now play section 4, we play the section 4 as written. So try implementing this process with one of the pieces that you're learning. And in the description box, I've put a list of the tutorials that I've done recently that use this process so you can get more ideas on it. And if you want to see the full tutorial on the serenade that uses the same process, I've linked the video here for you. If you're not already, please do subscribe to Tommy's Piano Corner. Don't forget to hit that little bell icon so you're notified of new videos as and when they're released. I thank you very much for watching today and look forward to seeing you very soon.